I want to introduce a friend of ours, the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. Kevin Roberts, how are you, my friend?
Well, it's great always being with you, and I can tell you 4 or 5 days into the Trump administration, I'm not yet tired of winning.
Yeah, well, that's good, because I think we got a long way to go. Isn't that fantastic? I mean, first of all, the January 6th pardons. You know, I know the left goes nuts about this, and yet the left is the party of the Weather Underground, the FALN, and we can go on, the Black Panthers, all these terrorist underground groups, all the things they blew up, all the people they killed, and these January 6ers didn't kill anybody. And there's Joe Biden giving, commutations to real killers in the federal system, the worst of the worst. So what do you make of these pardons in January 6th?
Well, we certainly celebrate the restoration of justice for those 1,500 J6 folks. And yet, if you take a step back and you think about how close we were to the other side winning, although obviously Trump won a clear victory, but, you know, the former vice president had a chance at winning this. If she had won, Mark, not only would those people still be in prison and a handful of them for the rest of their lives, but I think a lot of us would have been in trouble. I'll tell you a quick story. Our son is in college, and I talked to him the morning after the election. He's a college student, he's a conservative. And he said, Dad, congratulations on our side winning the election. But he said, most of all, congratulations to you, because we all know the FBI would have been at your door and the door of a lot of conservative activists. And so the lesson of this is that not only have we freed the J6 prisoners, but I'm hopeful that under the leadership of Pam Bondi at the Department of Justice, that we end once and for all the radical left setting up this double standard of justice.
You know, you make a tremendous point there. That is, they weren't done. The Justice Department wasn't done. They were going to round up more people, weren't they, Kevin?
They were. And, you know, I spend most of the day marching in the March for Life. Obviously, a lot of people in your audience are serious about the life issue. The point is, whether it's because you're a pro-life person or because you're generally a conservative or you're really focused on eliminating the Department of Justice's weaponization, a lot of us were on the FBI's list. And this is why early in Trump's presidency, he wanted to free these J6 prisoners, certainly intrinsically for the justice that was owed them, but also I think is a very significant sign to the deep state that he's not playing games. He's here to clean up the mess that they've made, and they've done it at the expense of the law, at the expense of the freedom of innocent Americans.
Oh, my God, that's really just so true. And what do you make of this? These executive orders? I'm talking to Kevin Roberts, the head muckety-muck over there at the Great Heritage Foundation. What do you make of these? You know, we talk about the first 100 days. What do you make of the first 100 hours?
Man, as you know, I had high hopes for the first days and weeks of the Trump presidency, but somehow, some way, in typical Trump fashion, he's surpassed that with just the shock and awe. And think about it, Mark. Now, you know, in the last hour, he's announced a great pro-life executive order we were sort of waiting to hear about today. And therefore, he has covered in his first 5 days in office through executive orders every public policy issue there is, from foreign policy to national security to taxation to tariffs to the life issue. He's on a roll.
We're talking to the president of the Heritage Foundation, one of the premier organizations for conservatism in this nation, the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. What did the president do, you said, respecting the pro-life movement today?
He addressed the Mexico City policy, where there can't be any federal funding for abortions internationally from the American taxpayer. So, you know, this is a typical yo-yo that dates back to the Reagan years, and there's an expectation, although I'll say as a pro-lifer, we don't feel entitled to this, an expectation that given President Trump's pro-life record that he would do that. And so what a great day to do it.
He's really been remarkable on these subjects, hasn't he? On morality.
He has. I mean, I think about, I was at the National Religious Broadcasters Conference speaking right before him, and the point that I made to him, thinking about how each of us is imperfect, right? That we're not electing a pastor of the country, we're electing a president. But I will also say that as I get older, I can tell a lot about a man or a woman based on the quality of his children. And just think about the totality of the Trump children. They're accomplished, they're good men and women, and all of that to say that when he spoke to tens of thousands of pro-life marchers, most of them high school and college students today, Mark, they were really touched. They were really moved because this is a man who himself, like so many Americans, has evolved on the issue. And I hope he understands and his administration understands how grateful those of us who are lifelong pro-lifers are for his message today and for the outstanding speech that followed his message by Vice President Vance.
Do you think it's fair to say that he's one of the most conservative presidents in history? And I say it this way. You look at the border, you look what he's done with taxes, you look what he's done with the Supreme Court and other judgeships. Excuse me. You look what he did with Roe. You look at all of these things, and I think to myself, you know, the Bushes could never do anything like this. And to me, he talks about common sense conservatism. They talk about populism. Call it whatever you want to. The fact of the matter is he's clearly a solid president. He doesn't come at it ideologically or philosophically. He just comes at it with common sense, no?
Yeah, and I think that's how most Americans do, right? You know how the D.C. chattering class is, and a lot of them who themselves really aren't very conservative, they probably don't even listen to your show or come to heritage events. They say, you know, Trump is just so they shouldn't be talking about who's a conservative. They say Trump's just a pragmatist, and I say, I don't think so. I said, look at his record. But the underlying truth there is that he comes at it from a standpoint of gut instinct, of common sense. And I think that's why he connects with the American people kind of across the political spectrum. And I also think it's why he's going to be even more successful in the second non-consecutive term, because we've lived through 4 years of the opposite of common sense, driven by a really radical ideology. I just can't help but see the hand of Providence over all of us.
And honestly, isn't it true that the Heritage Foundation over the years in his first term and even now has been really very supportive of this president in terms of its policies, its programs, and so forth, and personnel even? You've had personnel that have worked in his administration who used to work for Heritage and vice versa. I mean, there really is a real significant overlay here between the Heritage Foundation and Trump, don't you think?
Well, there is, and it makes sense that there would be, because to your point just now, Trump has governed like a conservative. Heritage is the largest conservative public policy organization in the world. You know us well, going back to the Reagan years when Heritage leaders then advised Reagan and his staff, like General Meese, whom you know well, and that custom has continued. But you know that influence that Heritage had waned some during the two Bush presidencies, and nothing against them as men, but they were not as conservative as Trump. And so it would make sense that given how unabashedly conservative Heritage always has been and how conservative Trump is governing, particularly with this wonderful breath of fresh air as his vice president, that there's going to be this overlap. And so we have seen a lot of colleagues go into the administration. Obviously, Trump and Vance and their advisors make those decisions. We don't feel entitled to that. But it's no surprise to me, being very happy to be as helpful as I possibly can on the outside, that overlap probably is going to be extended.
This is Kevin Roberts from the Heritage Foundation. And Kevin, what do you make of this constant effort to stop Pete Hegseth? You know, this is a man who's imperfect, was imperfect when he was younger, but they're accusing him of things he never did. You know, rape, for God's sakes. They've accused him of physical violence against his ex-wife, which he said simply never happened. And this is a man who has become a born-again Christian, I would argue, and he would argue. And what do you make of their efforts to try and destroy and stop him? They seem to find, they think they can pick one or two or three and just kind of destroy them. And this is their technique, isn't it?
It's gross. I mean, this is the deep state at its worst, and they're picking on Pete, whom I've come to know well and respect, and I think his faith and born again Christian faith is very real. They're picking on him because he's going to be such an important reformer of making sure that at the Pentagon we're able to resuscitate Reagan's notion of peace through strength. In order to do that, you have to make some hard political and policy decisions about phasing out some weapons programs that simply can't be useful in the next war, and certainly sustain defense spending so that you can fight the next war well. Well, there are too many moneyed interests in D.C., including some in the Senate, to sort of accept that. And so the grossest part of this was a couple nights ago, referring to this episode you mentioned, where NBC News is running with this story that his ex-wife had already disavowed. So Heritage has spent over $1 million trying to get Pete confirmed, the entire cabinet confirmed. Your point, Mark, is excellent, because if they take Pete's scalp politically, then that's not going to be the only one. They're probably going to move on to a second, third, or fourth. And then Trump's agenda, the people's agenda, is arrested before it really even gets real momentum.
Yeah, they're gunning. They're still gunning for others too. I mean, this is the goal, to try and slow them down. This is what they do, and try and. Here's the way I see it: we need a Secretary of Defense. Right now, the bureaucrats are running the place. So, when you have Republicans like Murkowski and Collins, and maybe one or two others, who say no or they're dragging their feet, they're doing a grave disservice to the national security of this country, don't you think?
Well, they are. And just imagine if you're one of those Republican senators who votes against Hegseth, and God forbid he's not confirmed, and sometime between that vote and when the defense secretary is confirmed, there's some terrible national security disaster. That's on them. It is not an exaggeration to say that they have failed in the oath that they took when they swore into the U.S. Senate to protect and defend the people of the United States. And so I am very hopeful, as we have this conversation and this vote is imminent, that whatever ridiculous arguments are being made against Hegseth by the lamestream media and by the deep state are ignored by these Republican senators, because the American people will be better off with Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, I think he'd be fantastic. I think he will be fantastic. And I will say this for myself. If he's defeated because of a handful of Republicans, I will encourage my audience, millions of people, I will encourage my audience, particularly in these individual states where these people come from, to defeat these Republicans, because we can't have this anymore. They need to be united. Our numbers are too small, whether it's the House or the Senate. And I'll tell you something else, Kevin Roberts, talking to Kevin Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation. They wouldn't be in the majority in the Senate but for Donald Trump. Murkowski and Collins would be backbenchers on committees if it wasn't for Donald Trump. And he says he wants Pete Hegseth. He wants this team. You would think just for once in their damnable careers, this is just me, they would step back and say, okay, this is what the president wants, and that's what we'll do. But they don't do that, do they?
No, they don't. I mean, think about Senator Collins, think about Senator Murkowski, who say that they really want to bring back to the Senate this spirit of compromise, a word that I've grown to hate. And if in fact they're genuine about that, then the way they should have handled this would have been to have given the President of the United States the courtesy of a phone call or a visit and say, Mr. President, we have these qualms. We want to trade something. We want to compromise with you on this. And even then, I think that's ridiculous. I want to be clear. But if they're going to have this kind of opposition to Hegseth, they could have gone about it a much different way. All of that to say, if you're Murkowski, where Trump won by 13 points in Alaska, you're really out of step with your voters. And so I think that's precisely the kind of thing that ultimately gets Hegseth across the finish line. All of that to say, to your earlier point, the deep state and a handful of these Republicans are looking for other trouble to make. We have to be vigilant until every last nominee by Donald Trump is confirmed.
Mm-hmm. And I want to thank you and Heritage for putting up that $1 million and fighting. I think it's going to pay off, and we'll know in a few hours. Folks, if you want to learn more about the Heritage Foundation, I strongly encourage you to do it. Go to heritage.org, heritage.org. This is one of the premier liberty conservative organizations in America, period. Kevin Roberts is doing a fantastic job as president of that organization. And Kevin, have a fantastic weekend, and God bless you, my friend.
God bless you, brother. It's always great being with you. Thanks for everything that you do.
Likewise, likewise. Take care of yourself.